Need motivation?
Watch a top 10 of Belief Nation.
A lot of people don't read because they're afraid of books. The books aren't their friend. So you might want to get a few books and kind of make them your friend. You can start with simpler books, like fiction. There's lots of good fiction written for adolescents and children. It's pretty straightforward. You can start there. If you're interested in philosophy, there's lots of simple guides like The Idiot's Guide to different topics, or a beginner's guide. I read those things all the time when I'm first investigating a new topic. I start with the introductory material. And I make time for reading, and that was encouraged in my family. Like, I always read before I went to sleep. I read, and I still do that. Somewhat less so because I've become so distracted by social media. But you set aside a bit of time every day to read. And for me, it was always just before I went to bed. I go to bed, turn on the light, and read when I was a kid, for hours. And if you do something every day, you do a lot of it. And so I would say, well, if you want to read, if you want to make yourself educated, just put aside 20 minutes a day to read, or 10. Some small amount of time that you could actually steal, not 2 hours, because good luck, man. It's very unlikely you'll manage that. But 20 minutes a day, that's 2 hours a week. That's 700 hours a year. That's, even if you're a slow reader, that's a good number of books. And so you make it a habitual part of your life, and you decide that it's going to be something that you value. You investigate carefully what resistances you might have to that idea, because you might think, well, that's pseudo-intellectual, or there's something more productive I could be doing, or I'm intimidated by books, or I hate books because I wasn't good at reading when I was a kid and was humiliated because of it, or you've got something against intellectuals, or God, there might all sorts of resistances to picking up a book. And then you could listen to audiobooks. That's a good way around that. By hook or by crook, man. So you value it, you make it a regular part of your life, you practice doing it. And you need a higher goal too. Is like, well, why should you read? Well, it's so that you're more informed and you can think better. Well, why should you be more informed and think better? Because you won't walk blindly into so many pits. You'll be able to negotiate better in your life because you'll be more informed and more verbally fluent, and you'll have a better sense of how the world works, and you'll be able to hold your own in conversations, and that'll make you more confident. Those are all unbelievably good reasons. To be highly literate is an incredibly massive advantage, practical advantage, and it shouldn't be underestimated.
Rule number 2, consult your irritability.
I already knew that I was a pretty decent monster by the time I had kids, and I thought, well, my kid's little, like a baby or 2-year-olds, like I'm a horrible monster, and so there's an uneven power problem here. I better not let that child do anything that really makes me angry. Now and then you hear about something horrible that happens. When I was in Boston years ago, I read about a woman who plunged her 2-year-old daughter's arms into boiling water. You think, well, how in the world can that happen? It's like, well, she's probably hungover. She probably just lost her job. She was probably desperate in 6 different ways. She probably didn't have any decent disciplinary strategies for children. She probably didn't have anyone helping her. She was bitter and resentful and angry, and the child misbehaved at exactly the wrong moment. And you're going to be around your children a lot, and so you might want to have it so that they don't misbehave at exactly the wrong moment. Because all hell can break loose if they can, and I didn't want that to happen. And I knew that it was easy for people to hate their children, even though they mouth the words that they love them all the time. I saw very little evidence of that in many situations. And so one of the things, you have a natural affinity for children, and even maybe a more powerful natural affinity for your own children. So that's a good start. But you don't want to set them up as an enemy against you. You don't want to allow them to engage in the kind of hierarchical challenge that makes you irritable and resentful. That's not a good idea. And if the things they do make you dislike them, the probability that they will make other people dislike them is extraordinarily high. And so you can consult your own irritability. And you can say, look, kid, I used to tell my kids this, when they were 3 or 4, I'd say, look, I'm not in a very good mood, and I'm likely to be unreasonable, so it'd be best if you'd go in your room and play for a while. It's like, I like you, man, you're a great kid, but get the hell out of here for a while, and they were fine with that. We'd trained them already at that point to be able to go play by themselves in their room, which is something a kid should be able to do anyways, but you need to know what sort of monster you are if you're going to be a good parent. And if you think, oh, I'm not a monster, it's like, oh, yes, you are. You're just an unbelievably unconscious monster, and that's actually the worst kind. So, and then the other thing about that chapter is there's an idea in it, and it's an idea that I think is well supported by the relevant literature, which is that your fundamental job as a parent, especially of a child from 0 to 4, is to make that child eminently desirable socially. So you're a successful parent if, when your child is 4, all sorts of other children want to play with him or her. That's really that's like if you want one marker of whether or not you've been successful, that's it. Now, some children are a lot harder to get along with than others, and some children have a harder time playing. And so I'm not saying that every parent who has a child that isn't popular at 4 is at fault for that. I'm not saying that. I'm saying the reverse, which is you can be sure that you've been successful if your child is not popular exactly, but desirable as a playmate. And so then you think, well, what have you done for your child? Well, you've opened up the entire world of children to them. So because they know how to play, which is a very deep knowledge, and it starts to become inculcated probably at the breast, and certainly in the course of rough and tumble play at about 2 years of age. It's a deep embodied knowledge. They know how to play, like a good well-trained dog knows how to play. You meet a new dog and you go like this, and the dog goes like this, you think, oh, that dog, I can go like this and it won't bite me, right? It knows how to play. And a kid who's awake and alert is just like that. Like a well-socialized kid, if you know anything about kids, is you can take a 4-year-old and make a little play gesture at them and they'll smile right away and start playing just right now. And that's what you want for your kids. And then everywhere they go, other kids like them and will include them in their play, and play is the way that children develop. And so if other children include them in their play, then the children develop. And the poor kids that don't get befriended at the age of 4, the literature on this is crystal clear. If your child is an outcast at the age of 4, the probability that anything can be done about that is almost 0, no matter what you do. And I hate to be so blunt about that, but I know the literature, and that's what the literature suggests.
Rule number 3, tame the dragon.
There's a part of the brain called the hypothalamus, and it's very, very, very old. We share it with virtually every animal that has a nervous system. It sits above the spinal cord. It's extremely old, evolutionarily speaking, and half of it governs fundamental motivations. So it governs hunger, for example. So if you're hungry, you posit the existence of something that will satiate your appetite, a peanut butter sandwich, and then you're happy when you're moving towards the kitchen. And then maybe you get thirsty and the hypothalamus does that. And then maybe you need to use the washroom and maybe you're too hot. And that the hypothalamus pops up these little motivational frames, and then emotions modulate your movement towards the goal that's established by these fundamental motivations. But that's only half the hypothalamus. The other half is the origin of the dopaminergic system that mediates exploratory striving and positive emotion. And so the way our brains are set up, way below the neocortex, way older than that, the default position is if you're satiated in all the important dimensions, then you're curious and explore. Well, why? Well, because you might find new resources that could be used to satiate those fundamental motivations in the future. So that heroic drive into the unknown is unbelievably archaic. And then it's regulated by fear and pain. So you go into the unknown, well, you don't want to die. So if you get damaged, you experience pain, and you want to avoid pain, so you experience anxiety. These are very fundamental systems, and they are reflected in our narratives. That's essentially, as far as I can tell, why the dragon hoards treasure everywhere. The dragon is an amalgam of predatory stimuli and fire, which is a destructive force, but also very useful. So dragon is something like predatory destructive entity. And you might say, well, is that real? It's like, well, yeah, but it's a meta-category. It's like there are lions and raptors and lizards, let's say, 60 million years ago when we were still in trees. The idea that there's a meta-predator is a great idea, A meta-predator is what all predators share in common. That's a dragon. Well, what should you do with a dragon? Well, avoid it. That's one answer. Another answer is burn it out of its lair so that it doesn't have baby dragons. An even more sophisticated answer is, well, confront it. You can feed your family with the body of a dragon. It's treasure.
Rule number 4, be of service.
There's a higher order moral principle that needs to be brought into the situation. And you sort of described that right at the beginning of the question, because you said, well, partly what you do when you move from an addicted state, from a psychological perspective, is move from a viewpoint of the gratification of immediate desire and maybe the accumulation of things as a marker of success, to the notion that, no, you actually have a higher purpose, and that higher purpose might involve being of service. That could be of service to yourself, which means you wouldn't be addicted anymore, because that's not a good way of being of service to yourself, but of service to yourself and the broader community, however you might define that. That's a higher order purpose, and it can integrate your motivations at a level that doesn't leave you at the whim of impulse. That's the purpose of a higher order motivation.
Also, to make sure you're actually taking action after watching this video, I've designed a special free worksheet just for this video. The worksheet will highlight all of the lessons learned in this video, as well as pull out our 3 favorite learnings and quotes that will inspire you to actually do something. The worksheet will also give you space to write down what your key takeaways are and your specific plan of action to make sure you're getting results. If you want the worksheet designed specifically for this video, absolutely for free, there's a link in the description below. Go click on it and start building the momentum in your life and your business. I'll see you there.
Rule number 5, make things better.
You do what you can to make the things around you better. You better, your family better, and then whatever you can manage in your community. You know, if you're interested in the drug addicted and the mentally ill, you know, there are you could volunteer. You could talk to those people and listen, because then you'd find out what the hell their problems are. And then you'd have some sense about how they might be helped, you know, but that's a hard thing. There's no helping from above. Drug addiction and its combination with mental illness, unbelievably complicated problems. There's no simple solutions. So, and it isn't even necessarily obvious that the people that you see who are homeless and drug addicted and mentally ill don't want to be helped. Is that sometimes they have problems that are so absolutely overwhelming that they can't be helped in any real sense. You know, like if they're unmedicated schizophrenic, for example, with a drug problem, it's just a nightmarish, it's a nightmare of insane complexity, because schizophrenia is very, very difficult to deal with, even with medication, because the medication that helps people who are schizophrenic also tends to depress their positive emotion and decrease their motivation, you know. So the medications are generally helpful, and the proper treatment guidelines, if you're schizophrenic, generally are stay with your medication, because despite the negative consequences of the medication, which aren't trivial, the consequences of not taking it are worse, and that's a real Hobson's choice, right? It's a bit of hell in both directions. But if you really want to know, I would say go have some contact with those people and listen to them and learn what the problems are. And maybe you could start seeing what might be helpful. It's a really complicated problem. And it's different than the problem of helping people who don't want to be helped, because you have to figure out who it is that doesn't want to be helped first. And you don't want to assume that just because someone's homeless that they don't want to be helped. I mean, that doesn't mean that it's easy to figure out how to help them. It's not easy. Helping people is a very difficult business, and it's a very dangerous business too, because you get tangled up in ways that you wouldn't expect, and that can be an occupational hazard, let's put it that way.
Rule number 6, maintain attractiveness.
If you don't allow your children to engage in dislikable behavior, then adults will like them, because adults actually like kids. You know, one of the things I loved about having little kids in Montreal, I lived in a poor area in Montreal. There's a lot of rough guys around there, and we used to roll our daughter around in a stroller, and these rough guys, you know, like God only knows what they were up to. They were rough-looking guys. You know, we'd roll our daughter by them, and they'd like smile, and they'd crouch down and make little goo faces, and you know, they were I tell you, one of the great things about having little kids is they bring out the best in other people. You see a whole side of humanity, even among the darker parts of humanity. You see a whole side of them that you wouldn't normally see, and it's lovely. And the thing is, if you're good to your kid in the real way, you can help them maintain that tremendous attractiveness that they have as young children, and to respond to adults properly, like a puppy that wags its tail instead of growls and goes for your ankle. And then wherever they go, adults welcome them and teach them things and pat them on the head and smile at them genuinely instead of saying, oh my God, here comes that couple with that goddamn brat again. Which is that's a horrible thing to do to a child. Because then everywhere they go, all the goodwill is false. There's nothing that you can do to someone that's more terrible than to put them in a world where all the goodwill directed towards them is false. That's a terrible thing.
Rule number 7, put your act together.
I took what I learned about what happened in the Second World War seriously. It's like, wow, we can be really bad. We should do something about that. Like, that was unacceptable. Well, was it or not? Well, how unacceptable? Was it change your life unacceptable? Better be, if you want it not to happen again. And it's not like the next time it happens will make the previous time look like a picnic. We're way more powerful than we were. When we're getting to the point, this is something Jung talked about, especially near the end of his life, we're getting so powerful that each individual is now a force of almost unimaginable destructive power if they so choose to be. And that power is going to continue to increase. And what that means is that the degree to which each of us has our act together is going to be something upon which the world increasingly depends for its maintenance.
Rule number 8, overcome rumination.
How do I stop ruminating? These thoughts are recurring and relate to every and any embarrassing moment I have ever had during my lifetime. I'm a 76-year-old woman. Well, here's something you could try. Write down everything that you're ruminating about. I know that seems counterproductive, but ruminations come up accidentally, involuntarily, unconsciously. Whereas if you write down everything that you're ruminating about, you're facing them voluntarily. So I would say, open up a journal or a Word document, whatever, and write down every time you ruminate about something, write it down and write down every rumination you can remember exhaustively. Write them all down. That would be the first thing. And the second thing is standard behavioral therapy practice. The next thing would be write down why you think they happened so that you get a good causal account. And then write down, what you might have done about them then, but more importantly, what you could do about them in the future to avoid that. Because it doesn't matter that something embarrassing happened to you once. What matters is whether or not you're likely to repeat it in the future. But my suspicions are that even if you could just start simply. Write down every ruminating thought that you have voluntarily and think about them in detail and write them down in detail. Get every little word down. And then you have that document. And then when you have a thought and start to ruminate on it, then sit down later after the ruminating thought goes away and bring it to mind voluntarily. So every time you have a thought you don't want to have, later practice having that thought on purpose. And try that for about a month and see what happens. Because it's often the case that if you start thinking about the thoughts you're ruminating on consciously and confront them voluntarily, that they will start to go away.
Rule number 9, don't dwell on revenge.
You see these mass shootings all the time and everyone does the same thing. Oh, how did that happen? Why did that happen? How can it be this way? It's like, well, why don't you read what they said about why they did it and just assume that that's the reason. And if you go, oh, well, the Columbine kids. Oh yeah, it was like Oh, they must have been bullied. Oh, yes, because, the natural response of anyone who's been bullied is to go arm yourself to the teeth to plot the destruction of the entire city. I think it was of Detroit, to line your entire high school avenue with bombs and then to go and shoot your classmates. That's what happens when you're bullied. It's like, no, that's not what happens when you're bullied. That's a stupid explanation. It's shallow beyond belief. And it really emerges only because people don't want to contend with the real issue. And the Columbine kids, well, they were contending with the real issue. They basically said quite forthrightly that in their own arrogant estimation, being itself was corrupt and unnecessary, and it would be best if it was eradicated in the most brutal possible way as fast as possible. And you get to places like that if you dwell on revenge for 3 or 4 years in your mom's basement. You can go to very dark places.
And rule number 10, the last one before some very special bonus clips, is aim at something.
Pick something. Pick something. Aim at it. As you move toward it, you'll get wiser. Then maybe your aim will change. That's okay. But at least it'll change in an informed way. It's like discipline yourself in one dimension. See what happens. Well, that's exciting. And I think that's something that's open for everyone. You can do that. I shouldn't say that because I don't believe that. I think you can find yourself in a situation that's so dire that there's no escape from it. But that doesn't matter because this is, the hero myth might not be, the best we have might not always work. But it's still the best we have. And the fact that it might not work doesn't mean we should throw it away. It's still the best we have. I mean, everyone dies, and so we fail in some sense. The fact that a symphony ends doesn't mean that it wasn't worth listening to.
Lecture is a form of theater. Now, it's a serious form of theater, but theater can be serious, and there's because partly what I'm doing is I'm presenting ideas to an audience, but I'm also modeling the act of engaging with ideas. And that's the theatrical end of it. And I don't give the same talk twice. Like, I have my stories and I have my collection of things I know and I talk about, but I try to do two things. I'm always talking to specific individuals in the audience. And so I'm having a conversation with the audience. And so that's part of the dynamic element of the performance. And the other thing I'm trying to do is to further my thinking on the topics that I'm addressing. And there is a theatrical element to that because it's like, I think the closest thing really that it compares to is probably stand-up comedy. Although I think the routines that comedians have are probably more well and formally practiced than the ones than the talks that I engage in. And I don't really think of it as delivering a lecture to an audience. I'm trying to think about complicated things in real time with an audience there to participate and to use the audience as an indicator of whether what I'm saying is gripping and comprehensible. Silicon Valley tends to be liberal. Everyone knows that. And the reason for that is that there's a tremendous number of entrepreneurs there. And entrepreneurs tend to be high in openness and lower in conscientiousness. So they're creative, but they're also willing to break rules, which you kind of have to do often. Hopefully not to a criminal extent, but you have to. It's tricky when you're trying to establish something new because look at a company like Uber, they had to bend the rules to be successful. And those companies that have rented those scooters out and put them on the streets everywhere, they just kind of went ahead and did it. It's not something an orderly person would do because they'd ask for permission, whereas the people who started these scooter rental companies just said, well, what'll happen if we put them everywhere? And the answer was that seemed to work, but, you have to have a rule-breaking proclivity in order to manage that.
Take a bit of a look at yourself and think about what's not so good that you could improve, that you should improve by your own standards, and that you would improve, and set yourself a little goal. Maybe you're not studying at all and you're at university. Or maybe you're at work and you've got this stack of paper there, and you haven't looked at that damn stack for like a month, and you know that you should be, and you're bothering yourself at night because you're avoiding that. It's like maybe think, well, I've avoided that stack of paper completely for 1 month. I'm quite a coward when it comes to whatever snakes might be hidden in that stack of paper. How about tomorrow I just put that stack of paper in front of me on my desk and I glance through it for 15 seconds. See if I can do that. It's like, well, you set yourself a goal of improvement. It's a humble goal, because really, are you such a coward that the best that you can bloody well manage after a month of avoidance is 15 seconds of exposure to a stack of paper? It could easily be. You've been avoiding it. So you're obviously afraid of it. And so the situation could be that dismal and dire. And you might think, well, geez, it's no balm to my ego. It's not fostering the strength of my ego to recognize in myself someone who could only withstand 15 seconds of exposure to that thing I'm afraid of. And so that's a form of humility too. It's like, there's things you could do to improve, and you know what they are. And there's small steps that you could take, that you might take, that would put you in that direction. And then the question is, are you big enough to take those small steps? Are you capable of grappling with the fact that you're fundamentally flawed to the point where you have to break things down into almost childlike steps in order to manage them? And the answer to that is, yeah, you are. And that's the lot of, I don't know if it's a lot of everyone. Most people have things they avoid, and they're afraid of. So I would say to some degree, it's the lot of everyone. People vary in the degree to which they've conquered that. And you do meet people from time to time who are extraordinarily disciplined. But most of the time, they've got disciplined in exactly this manner. It's through slow incremental improvement. And then you challenge yourself. It's like, well, could I do this? That would be better. Then you find out. And then you think, well, is there something slightly larger and more challenging that I could do that would be better? And you try it and you find out. And as you try it and you find out, generally you get better at it and you can take on larger and larger challenges.
In any case, people do waste a lot of time, and they also act counterproductively a lot of the time. Regardless, we do make progress, and we can thrive under the difficult conditions that make up our lives, and we can resist the malevolence that entices us. That's within our power, and we don't know the limits to that. And we also know that it's better to, we all know this, that it's better to live courageously than cowardly. Everyone knows that. That's what you teach people that you love. And we know that it's better to live truthfully than in deceit. And you can tell that too, because that's also what you tell people that you love. And we know that you should pick up your damn responsibility and move forward. Everyone knows that. It's part of our intrinsic moral nature. And that nature is there. And it's not difficult to communicate to people about this. Like, everyone knows that you wake up at 3 in the morning when you've let your life go off the rails, and that you berate yourself for your uselessness and your cruelty and your failure to take the opportunities that are in front of you. And if you were the master in your own house, in some sense, the captain of your own destiny, if there was no intrinsic nature, well, that would never happen. You'd just let yourself off the hook. There'd be no voice of conscience tormenting you. But no one escapes from that. And what that indicates, to me, is that, at least psychologically, we live in a universe that's characterized by a moral dimension, and we understand that well, and that moral failings have consequences, and that they're not trivial. They destroy you. They destroy your family. They destroy your community. And you can tell people that. And they listen because they know. They don't know they know. That's the thing. And maybe that's the thing about being an intellectual. You have the opportunity to articulate ideas that other people know, they embody, but they can't articulate. And that's what people tell me. They say, well, you help me give words to things that I always knew to be true but couldn't say. Or they say, I've been trying to put some of your precepts into practice,
responsibility being a main one, vision another, honesty, I suppose bringing up the pack and saying, and this is the fun part of doing all of this. Fun is a weak word. That it's the remarkable part of doing all this. I mean, I have people tell me constantly wherever I go, it's so delightful that, you know, they were in a pretty dark place and they tell me why. And there's plenty of dark places in the world. And they decided, well, maybe they were going to develop a bit of a vision and take a bit more responsibility. If you really want to solve a complicated problem, maybe you try to solve it 100 ways. And then you take the best solution.
Got it.
And look, this happens to entrepreneurs all the time too. You know, like most entrepreneurs, this is something to know, well, most entrepreneurs, most creative people fail at producing their creative product and monetizing it, right? So your default position, if you're a creative person, is you're going to fail. And so, and that's because it's hard to come up with something new, and it's hard to present it to the market at the right time, and it's hard to market it. Like, those things are really, really difficult. And so what successful entrepreneurs do is they just keep doing it over and over and over and over and over and over and over. And eventually, if they're fortunate, one of their ideas happens to hit the right place at the right time. And so that's also Darwinian in some sense. You know, you're creating all these little enterprises that are sort of alive. They're run by people after all. And even if your idea is good, that doesn't mean it will be successful. There's so many things that have to be taken into account. So this is partly why persistence, and that's part of conscientiousness, is so useful. It's like, you know, what do they say? If at first you fail, then try again. And that would probably mean try something different rather than the same thing. But persistence is helpful because it enables you to run many, many experiments. And you need to know that the baseline is failure. You know, it's important because otherwise you'll blame that on yourself. I would say for the last 45 years, we've told, psychologists have been certainly to blame for this, at least in part. You're okay the way you are. That's what we tell young people. Oh, you're okay the way you are. It's like, and there's nothing worse than you can tell someone who's young than that, especially if they're miserable. You know, and lots of them, well, if they're miserable and aimless, it's like, oh, I'm miserable and aimless, and sometimes I'm suicidal and I'm nihilistic and I don't have any direction in your life. In my life. It's like, well, you're okay the way you are. And it's like, they don't want to hear that. They want to hear, look, you know, and you know this, you're useless. You know nothing. You haven't got started. You've got 60 years to put yourself together, and God only knows what you could become. And that message is so much more, it's so funny because it's such an attack, but it's so positive because there's faith there in the potential that makes up the person rather than the miserable actuality that happens to be manifesting itself at the moment. And young people respond extraordinarily well to that because, and you know that if you're a parent and you love your child, your son, your daughter, what you're trying to foster is the best in them. You want that to manifest itself across the course of their life. You want them to become continually more than they are, to see what they could be. And I think that's part of the great message of the West, is that that's the ethical requirement of individual being in the proper sense, is to constantly note that you're not what you could be, to take responsibility for that, and to commit yourself, like body and soul, to the attainment of that ideal. The first thing I think you need to understand is that these people that you're comparing yourself to, you don't really know very well. You know, and what that means is that you see their shiny outside, but you don't see the reality of their life. And so what you're... You know, maybe you're in California, see someone speeding down the road in a convertible Porsche, and you think, oh man, what a lucky bastard. And the truth of the matter is that he's thinking about wrapping his expensive sports car around the next cement pillar that he comes close to. You know, you can't tell.
people have hard lives, and even people who are comparatively fortunate have hard lives. And so the ideal that you're observing that makes you jealous and resentful is in large part an illusion that's created by your own mind. And I can give you just one example. Like, I know a fair number of extremely wealthy people, and most of the people I happen to know are people who've made their money themselves. And I tell you, man, they have a burden of responsibility that would crush me, would crush the typical person. They're just working flat out, like 90 hours a week, and they have thousands of people depending on them. And they have their money, and they have their status, and that's not nothing. But don't be thinking that there isn't a price to be paid for that. They don't see their families, they're often divorced, they don't see their children grow up, and they don't have time off. Now, there are wealthy, what would you call, playboy types, I suppose, who live out the dreams of wealth of a foolish 14-year-old, but they're not that common, and you have to be careful of what you're jealous of because you don't really know what it is. And then the other thing that's kind of useful is to understand that you're different from everyone else. And this is especially true as you get older. When you're 17 or 16 or something like that, comparing yourself to other people makes a certain amount of sense, because 16 and 17-year-olds, they're kind of the same, which is why when you go off to university, you can make friends so quickly. It's like, I'm just about 60. It takes me like 15 years to make a friend now, as opposed to the 2 months that it took when I was 17. You're quite different from other people, and you shouldn't be comparing yourself to them because they're not like you. They don't have your family. They don't have your temperament. They don't have your troubles. They don't have your abilities. The only person that The only person that has those is you. And this is why one of the rules, I think it's rule 4, is compare yourself to who you were yesterday and not to who someone else is today. And see, that's a game you can win, because you could be a little better today than you were yesterday. And that's a good thing. You're a little better. That's a good thing. And no doubt there are some things that you could improve. If you sit and meditate for any length of time about what you're not doing optimally, answers will spring to mind.
You have to be humble and wise enough to understand that you might have to aim pretty damn low, especially in those places where you're not functioning well. And it might be so embarrassing that you can't bring yourself to fathom that that's actually who you are. But, Jung described the fool, the archetypal figure of the trickster and the fool, as the precursor to the savior, to the redeemer. And that's an unbelievable bit of wisdom, because what Jung meant was that to put yourself together, which is to follow the path of redemption, to follow the redeemer. If the redeemer is a type of personality that you could, in fact, be inhabited by or manifest, then the first steps towards that is to allow yourself to be a fool, right? It's because you don't know what you're doing. You have to admit that. And there's going to be a loss of ego or destruction of ego, arrogant ego that necessarily accompanies that. But you need the loss of that arrogant ego, because it's precisely what's interfering with your movement forward. It's part of the adversarial process, mythologically speaking, that stops moral progress. You're too proud of who you think you are to notice what you're like so that you could change properly. You don't want to sacrifice that part of yourself. It's probably associated with some delusion that helps you maintain, what would you say, a positive, although very fragile self-image, in the absence of genuine effort.
You can look at that pessimism that constitutes, let's say, the core of what
Well, I think it's the core religious message, really, is the tragic nature of the world, the reality of suffering. It's part of the core religious message. But what emerges out of that, properly conceptualized, is a remarkable appreciation for what human beings are capable of. Like, we are unbelievably resilient and able creatures, and we do not have any conception of our upper limits.
You'll discover a little bit more about your potential as you discover who you are, especially the darker parts of yourself, because then you discover your potential for mayhem. There's some real utility in that. You know, a discovery that you're dangerous. It's such a useful discovery. It's actually something that strengthens you, because the first thing that a realization like that can, in fact, produce is the ambition to incorporate that danger into a higher order personality, that dangerousness into a higher order personality. And that can make you implacable. That can make you someone who can say no when you need to say no. You know, that can make you someone who won't avoid necessary conflict. And so that's unbelievably useful.
When you're moving through life and you have a plan or a dream and it shatters, you know, someone dies or a relationship breaks apart, or you have a terrible upset in your career, or you become ill in some unexpected way, then everything around you falls apart and you plunge into a chaotic underworld.
The belly of the whale.
Yeah, that's exactly right. Yes, exactly that. And then maybe you stay there, because it isn't necessarily the case that people get out. You know, people die, people are in despair permanently, but frequently something tragic and terrible befalls you, and you fall apart, and you learn something profound as a consequence, and you put yourself back together, and when you come back out, you're more than you were when you went in. And that's happening at a small scale. Every time you learn something, you know, if you ever really learn something, it's usually painful. It usually means that you have to recognize that you're wrong in some important way. You have to let that part of you that's wrong die, and then you have to let a new part of you. Okay, so the self, imagine that you undergo a series of transformations in your life. There are collapses into the chaotic underworld, and then mini resurrections. That happens continually.
Tell your kid, here's an impossible thing, why don't you go out and fail? You say, here's something worth going after. Here's a step you could take that would push you beyond where you are, but that you also have a reasonably high probability of succeeding at, right? They call that
within a time frame.
Within some time frame. That's the other thing. You have to parameterize it with regards to time frame. That's right. And that puts you in the zone of proximal development, and that's a concept that was generated by a guy named Vygotsky. He was a Russian developmental psychologist, and a smart one. It's where the idea of the zone comes from, to be in the zone. Yes. And when you're in the zone, you're expanding your skills in a manner that's intrinsically rewarding, because you're succeeding. And so you want to set, if you're good to yourself, you think, okay, I need to set a goal, but I need to set a goal that someone as stupid and useless as me could probably attain if they put some effort into it.
Right.
And then you've got it perfectly, because it's not so high that it's grandiose or impossible that you fail necessarily and then justify your bitterness. It's like, well, I could do well, because that happens to people.
Happens all the time.
Yeah, it's like,
see this all the time.
You know, it's like, yes, exactly. Well, I set a goal and I didn't attain it, so I'm not going to set any more goals.
Right.
It's like, no, you set a goal that was inappropriate
For the time frame.
Yeah. That's right. You didn't calibrate it properly. Yeah. And you're playing a trick on yourself, because you wanted to fail so that you could justify not having to try.
And being a victim. Yeah.
Which isn't helpful. You're still going to be a victim. It's like, there's no way out of that, man. Yeah. So, you know, because life is a challenge that in some sense can't be surmounted. So there's no way out of your problem. You have to move from point A to B in life, but point A is often a very difficult place to be, because we're fragile and bounded and mortal and limited, and because we know that. And so one of the implications of that, as many great religious traditions are at pains to illustrate or demonstrate or proclaim, is that life is essentially suffering. And I believe that to be a fundamental truth. But perhaps not the most fundamental truth, because I think the most fundamental truth is that despite the fact that life is suffering, people can transcend that. And partly the way they transcend that is by pursuing things of value. And so that if there is no value proposition at hand, then you have no meaning to justify the difficult conditions of your life. And that's brutally difficult for people. You know, Nietzsche said, he who has a why can bear any how. And you see, and I've certainly seen this as a clinical practitioner, that people who have no purpose in their life are embittered by the difficulties of their life. And they become first bitter, and then resentful, and then revengeful, and then cruel. And there's plenty of places to go past cruel. That's just where you start if you're really on a downhill path. We didn't understand that truth comes in different forms depending on its application. It's a tricky thing. There's the truths that apply when you're attempting to describe the transformations of the material world. And there's the truths that apply when you're trying to determine how it is that you should act while you're alive. And those have to come into alignment, but they're not in alignment right now. And my sense, and this is a sense that's been developed, at least in part from reading the great psychoanalysts, is that fictional accounts, metafictional accounts, even like biblical accounts, which are mythological, are stories about how it is that people should act, not stories about what the material structure of the world is.
The more radical the necessary change, the more pain that accompanies it. Like the more opportunity as well. And a lot of what we learn painfully. And so it's not surprising that people shrink away from learning. We learn in pain and anxiety very frequently. Everyone knows that. Like the things that you really learned in life, it's like, it was no joy, man. Like it took you out. And so the fact that people flee from that is hardly surprising. But it doesn't help, that's the thing. It just stores up the catastrophe for later. And so the better idea is to eat a little poison every day so that you don't have to overdose in a month. It's something like that. And it is the case that I think because you aren't forced to, first of all, you don't learn unless you're forced to learn. I know there's alternatives to that. There's the voluntary search for knowledge, and that's a fine thing, and that is an antidote to this. But apart from that, speaking more practically, you tend not to learn unless you're forced to learn, and what you tend to learn by force are difficult lessons. And so people are very prone to not seek that out. It's not surprising. But it's because they don't understand the consequences very well. You know, it's because they're convinced that there's some way of forestalling the necessary learning. And there isn't any way of forestalling it. All you do is make it worse in the future. You make yourself smaller and you make the lesson harder. And so that's why in so many religious doctrines there's emphasis on humility. You know, and humility isn't to debase yourself. It's to understand that you don't know enough so that your life isn't going to be miserable. And so every chance you get to grab something new that will help you along your way, you should take it as fast as you can. But you have to have a very tragic, I would say, view of reality, and also a harsh one, because it's not just tragedy, it's also malevolence. You have to understand that those are waiting for you, and that makes you desperate enough to learn, and that might make you desperate enough to fall out of your ideology. But that's a hard way of looking at the world. It beats living through it, though. One of the things I've been talking to my audiences about is the relationship between responsibility and meaning, which is, what would you say? It's a constant refrain in the book. It's one of its underlying messages, let's say, or themes is a better way of thinking about it. You know, if you start with the presumption that there's a baseline of suffering in life and that can be exaggerated as a consequence of human failing, as a consequence of malevolence and betrayal and self-betrayal and deceit and all those things that we do to each other and ourselves that we know that aren't good, that amplifies the suffering. That's sort of the baseline against which you have to work. And it's contemplation of that often that makes people hopeless and depressed and anxious and overwhelmed and all of that. And they have the reasons. But you need something to put up against that. And what you put up against that is meaning. Meaning is actually the instinct that helps you guide yourself through that catastrophe. And most of that meaning is to be found in the adoption of responsibility. So if you think, for example, about the people that you admire, well, you think about when you have a clear conscience first, because that's a good thing to aim at, which is something different than happiness, right?
A clear conscience is different than happiness.
Yeah, it's better.
Yeah. 'Cause
That's
you're not
better.
like guilting yourself. You're not feeling bad about yourself.
That's right. You feel that you've
Clean.
justified your existence,
Yeah.
right? And so you're not waking up at 3 a.m. in a cold sweat thinking about all the terrible things that you've involved yourself in.
What you
You know.
said to someone that you shouldn't have said, or how you acted, or lied.
What
or
opportunity you lost, or the things that you've let go that you should have capitalized on, and all of that. And so, if you think about the times when you're at peace with yourself with regards to how you're conducting yourself in the world, it's almost always conditions under which you've adopted responsibility, right? At least the most guilt I think that you can experience, perhaps, is the sure knowledge that you're not even taking care of yourself, so that you're leaving that responsibility to other people, because that's pretty pathetic. And unless you're psychopathic and you're living a parasitical life, and that characterizes a very small minority of people, and an even smaller minority think that's justifiable. But most of the time you're in guilt and shame because not only are you not taking care of yourself, let's say, so someone else has to, but you're not living up to your full potential. And so there's an existential weight that goes along with that. We kind of have this idea that, well, you're free as a child, and then let me see if I can put this properly, that you have a certain delightful, wonderful, positive freedom as a child, and then that's given up as you approach adulthood. But the truth of the matter is that you have a lot of potential as a child, but none of that is capable of manifesting itself as freedom before you become disciplined. And discipline is a matter of the imposition of order, and the order is necessary, especially for people who are hopeless and nihilistic. And lots of people are hopeless and nihilistic, way more people than you think. And part of that is because no one's ever really encouraged them. And so the book is in part a matter of encouragement. It's like, lay a disciplinary structure on yourself, get the chaos in check, and then you can move towards a state that's freer, because it's discipline first. Like, look, if you're going to become a concert pianist, there's going to be several thousand hours of extraordinarily disciplined practice. That's the imposition of order on your potential, let's say. But what comes out of that is a much grander freedom. Your best bet is truth. But that doesn't necessarily mean that's always going to do the trick. Right? I mean, sometimes you go fight a dragon and it eats you. And if you being eaten wasn't a real possibility, it wouldn't be a real fight. And so you see people, like I've seen people in my clinical practice sometimes. I had one client in particular who was undergoing a particularly vicious divorce with someone who was really seriously inclined to take him out and would do pretty much everything at her disposal to do so. And I strategized with him for about 3 years. And we did everything, and hyper carefully. He was a very conscientious and diligent person, and he put into practice everything that we discussed and strategized, and he still he got backed into a corner so hard that I didn't know how to help him anymore. So I would say, however, that he was a very truthful person throughout that, and one thing he did do was, part of it was a custody battle, and he did manage, despite his decline in consequence of being repeatedly cornered, I would say, he did manage to establish what I think was a lasting relationship with his kids. So he might have got enough out of what he did to justify it, even though the whole landscape was pretty awful. I think that not lying is your best bet, but life is hard and people get run over, and it doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to emerge in any obvious sense triumphant. But if you take the alternative path, especially when you're facing severe tribulations, let's say, and you complicate those with deceit, you can be sure that whatever tragedy that you're confronting is going to turn into not only tragedy, but something very much akin to hell. And so you might be able to at least minimize the degree of suffering, even if you can't overcome it or transcend it. People came to my website because they were interested in, well, before the political stuff blew up, I had 1 million views on YouTube, which isn't nothing. 1 million of anything is a lot. But then when the political scandals started to break, then people came for them but stayed for the content, and that's been really useful. Yeah, well, it's been, well, and it's not that surprising. Well, because of what you do, it's like there's a great hunger for information that is practical and useful, and that helps people find meaning in their lives and orient themselves. There's a great hunger for that, and most of my lectures were derived from solid psychology, some of it experimental, some of it biological, some of it from the domains of neuroscience, a lot of it from great clinicians. It's not surprising that people find it helpful because, well, great clinicians were great because they were really helpful. And so to distill that and to offer it to people in a digestible form, to have that have a good effect on them, well, that's what you'd expect. That's what the whole discipline is about. And so that's been great. This circumambulation that Jung talked about was this continual, we'll return to this continual circling in some sense of who you could be. You might notice, for example, that there are themes in your life. You know, when you go back across your experiences, you see you kind of have your typical experience that sort of repeats itself. And there might be variation on it, like a musical theme, but it's like you're circling yourself and getting closer to yourself as you move across time. That's the circumambulation. Now, you remember that for a sec, because we'll go back to it. Okay, so imagine that something glimmers before you. It's an interest that's dawning, and you decide, well, first of all, you're paralyzed. You think, well, how do I know if I should pursue that? It's probably a stupid idea. And the proper response to that is, you're right, it probably is a stupid idea, because almost all ideas are stupid. And so the probability that as you move forward on your adventure that you're going to get it right the first time is zero. It's just not going to happen. And so then you might think, well, maybe I'll just wait around until I get the right idea, and which people do, right? So they're like 40-year-old, 13-year-olds, which is not a good idea. And so they wait around until it's waiting for Godot, until they finally got it right. But the problem is you're too stupid to know when you've got it right. So waiting around isn't going to help, because even if the perfect opportunity manifested itself to you in your incomplete form, the probability that you would recognize it as the perfect opportunity is zero. You might even think it's the worst possible idea that you've ever heard of anywhere. Highly likely, highly likely. So you have, Nietzsche called that a will to stupidity, which I really liked. So, because he thought of stupidity as being you have to take it into account fundamentally and work with it. And so you can take these tentative steps on your pathway to destiny, and you can assume that you're going to do it badly. And that's really useful, because you don't have to beat yourself up. It's pretty easy to do it badly. But the thing is, it's way better to do it badly than not to do it at all. You start your path and you think that you're heading, towards your star. And so you go in that direction. And then, because you're here, the world looks a particular way, but then when you move here, the world looks different, and you're different as a consequence of having made that voyage. And so what that means is that now that thing that glimmers in front of you is going to have shifted its location, because you weren't very good at specifying it to begin with, and now that you're a little sharper and more focused than you were, it's going to reveal itself with more accuracy to you. And so then you have to take it's almost like a 180-degree reversal. But it isn't, because, you've gone this far, and that's a long ways to get that far. But that's a lot farther than you would be if you just stayed where you were, waiting. And so it doesn't matter that you overshoot continually, because as you overshoot, even if you don't learn what you should have done, you're going to continually learn what you shouldn't keep doing. And if you learn enough about what you shouldn't keep doing, then that's tantamount at some point to learning at the same time what you should be doing. So it's okay. So it's like this. Now, what's cool about it, though, I think, is that as you progress, the degree of overshooting starts to decline. The fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean you have to stop. And thank God for that. That's a really useful thing. And the fact that you're full of faults doesn't mean that you can't learn. And so you can posit an ideal, and you're going to be wrong about it, but it doesn't matter, because what you're right about is positing the ideal and moving towards it. If the actual ideal isn't conceptualized perfectly, well, first, surprise, surprise, because what are you going to do that's perfect? So it doesn't matter that it's imperfect. It just matters that you do it and that you move forward.
So that's really positive news as far as I'm concerned, because you can actually do that, right? You can do it badly. Anyone can do that. So that's useful.
You're one of the best communicators that I've ever listened to. If I could be half as good at you, or at communicating as you are, I would be set. How can I teach myself to do that?
Practice. You know, really, like, well, there's a couple of things. Helps to read a lot. It really helps to write. So if you want to make yourself articulate, which is a very good idea, then not only should you read, but you should write down what you think. And if you can do that a little bit every day, 15 minutes, maybe you could steal 15 minutes and do it every day. But if you do that for 10 years, you really straighten out your thinking. If you're going to speak effectively, you have to know way more than you're talking about, you know. So this is often difficult for beginning lecturers at university, because they'll do a lecture on a topic, but they only know as much as they're saying in the lecture. And they get kind of stuck to their notes because of it. But you want to know 10 times as much as you are saying in the lecture, and then you can specify a stepping path through it and elaborate with the other things that you know. But to do that, you have to do a lot of reading. But you also have to do a lot of reading, because that's where the synthesizing comes. So that's on the input side. And then on the output side, well, there's some techniques, let's say, is like if you're speaking in front of a group, you are not delivering a talk to a group. That's not what you're doing. The talk isn't a packaged thing that you present to a group. There isn't a group. There's a bunch of individuals, and you talk to them. So when I talk to a group, I always talk to people one at a time. And that makes it easier too, because you know how to talk to a person. It's like, can you talk to 1,000 people? Well, probably not, because it's too intimidating. But there isn't 1,000 people there. There's 1,000 individuals. And so you just look at an individual and you say something, and you can tell if they're engaged. They look confused, or they look interested, or they look angry, or they look bored, or maybe they're asleep, in which case you look at someone else. And they give you feedback about how you're doing. And so one thing is to have something to say, yeah, but the next thing is pay attention to who you're talking to. Because unless you're very badly socialized, and that seems unlikely in your case, because you present yourself at least moderately well, and well, I mean, I don't know you very well, but on first sight, you're doing fine. So the probability that if you pay attention to the individuals that you're talking to, that your natural wealth of social skill will manifest itself is extremely high. And so you don't deliver a talk to an audience. That's a really bad way of thinking about it. You're actually engaged in a conversation with an audience. Even if they're not talking, they're nodding and shifting position and looking like this, and you can pull all that in and use it to govern the level at which you're addressing the entire audience. So the last thing I would say is, well, having the aim to be a good communicator is a good start. And you think, well, I could buttress that to some degree. Well, there isn't anything that you can possibly, this is the whole point of a liberal education, there isn't anything that you can possibly do that makes you more competent in everything you do than to learn how to communicate. I don't care if you're going to be a carpenter. I mean, being a carpenter, by the way, is very difficult, especially if you're a good carpenter. But if you're good at communicating as a carpenter, you're like 10 times better as a carpenter. So, and this is something that the liberal arts colleges, I think, I don't know if they've forgotten it, but they don't do a very good job of marketing. It's like, well, what's the use of a bachelor's degree, a Bachelor of Arts? It's like, well, you can think, you can write, you can speak, you've read something. It's like, the economic value of that is incalculable. The people that I've watched in my life who've been spectacularly successful they have skills. Clearly, that's a minimum precondition. But they're also very, very good at articulating themselves. And so whenever they negotiate, they're successful. Well, that's kind of like the definition of success in life, right? You negotiate and it doesn't mean you win. Because if you're a good negotiator, if you're a really good negotiator, everybody walks away from the negotiation thrilled.
And so then people line up to do things with you. So, and that's all dependent on your ability to communicate. So practice. There is definitely an epidemic of overprotective parenting. But it's useful to ask why. And my suspicions is that this is driven by very fundamental biological and cultural phenomena that aren't generally considered in relationship to this issue. We don't have very many children. We don't have 12, 6 of whom die. We have 1 or 2, and that makes them very precious, right? We're unwilling to take risks with them, and no wonder. And then we also have them much later in life. And so, like, if you have a kid when you're 18, you're still a kid. You're going to go out and have your life, right? Because you're you're in the height of your exploratory. You're in the height of the exploratory part of your life. You're not going to overprotect your kid because you're still a kid. But if you're 40 and you have 1 child, it's like all your eggs are in one basket. And the probability that you're going to take undue risks with that precious person is very, very low. Now, obviously, there's some advantages to that because, great, you devote resources to your child, and foster their development. But the downside is that you have every motivation to hover. And maybe you're also extraordinarily desperate as a mother to maintain that bond with your child because you've struggled so long to achieve it. It's highly, highly valuable. You can't take a risk. Well, so we might say, well, perhaps overprotective parenting is a secondary and unintended consequence of the birth control pill and the fact that people now have children later in life. Could easily be. If you have 6 kids, it's like, what are you going to do? Helicopter parent them? It's like, no, you're so tired you can't even get off the couch if you have 6 kids. And they outnumber you, right? They're raising each other. They're competing and they're taking each other down a peg. There's no overprotection there. But with a single child landscape or dual child landscape, mostly a single child landscape, then you're going to overprotect. And then that ethos starts to permeate the schools and it starts to permeate the higher education institutions as those children mature. And then that all reinforces it. It's not good. It's not obvious what to do about it either, because if it is driven by demographics in that sense, it's a much more intractable problem than we think. So I did some of that in 12 Rules for Life. I said, look, what you have to understand is that you're a danger to your children no matter what, right? You can let them go out in the world and be hurt, or you can overprotect them and hurt them that way. So here's your choice. You can make your children competent and courageous, or you can make them safe. But you can't make them safe because life isn't safe. So if you sacrifice their courage and competence on the altar of safety, then you disarm them completely. And all they can do is pray to be protected. You're going to use what you think to guide your action, and the consequence of that is going to be how your life turns out. So I'm dead serious about what I write because I know what the pathway is. It's like you don't communicate in a false manner, because if you do, you will warp the structure that guides your actions, and you will absolutely 100% suffer for that. I mean, one of the things I've learned as a clinical psychologist is that I've never seen anyone, it's really a terrifying thing, I've never seen anyone get away with anything, ever. The chickens always come home to roost. So, and sometimes it might, let's say you get away with something, it's like, yeah, you think so, man. You wait 5 years from now, 7 years from now, it'll come back.
Is that karma?
It's more like, yes, I think it's the same idea, but it's more like you don't have the power to manipulate reality. Like, you have the power to bring about reality in some sense, because you confront potential, and through your actions and your communicative intent, you turn potential into reality. But you don't have the power to bend reality without it snapping back at you.
You don't think so? So you don't think visionaries and influencers have the ability to bend reality?
No, I don't think they bend it. I think that they I mean, you can bring new things into being, but you can't get away with a falsehood. No, you can definitely bring new things into being.
You can't get away with a falsehood.
Yes, that's it. And
maybe, okay, makes sense.
And you can't get away with weak thinking either, because, I mean, any more than you can get away with improper action. It just doesn't work.
So you're contending. It's why, I mean, one of the themes in my writing is the danger of falsehood. And at every level, it's like, well, if you tell the truth to the degree that you can, or at least don't lie, I think that's rule 8, then you have reality on your side. You got to decide, man. You want reality on your side, or do you want reality against you? Now, I wouldn't recommend the whole reality against you thing, because you're not going to win. You're going to get flattened. And so I'm very careful with what I say, and I'm very careful with what I write.
We are thrown challenges, and that in some sense those are best construed as tests of our ethical ability. So what Jung thought, his idea was something like this, that at the beginning of time people were unconscious, and that consciousness emerged with all of its catastrophes, consciousness of death, for example. And one way out of the burden of consciousness was to return to unconsciousness. You can do that with alcohol. You can do that by being dependent. You can do that by failing to grow up. You refuse the burden of consciousness by becoming unconscious again. But there's another way forward, which is to become even more conscious. So the idea would be a little bit of consciousness is like an illness. But if you can expand that consciousness upwards enough, then it's something. It starts to become something that is its own cure. You know, because it's one thing to live properly, and that's not a trivial thing, but it's another thing to be able to articulate yourself and to be able to negotiate. And generally speaking, there's nothing about that that isn't advantageous. And even introverted and anxious people can learn to do that. You know, those are learnable skills. It's not easy, but you can manage it. You can also speak carefully, you know, and listen to what you're saying, and only try to say things that you think are true. That's also unbelievably useful. You have to feel that out. Like, is this really what I believe, or am I putting it forward, well, because I want to look good, or I want to dominate, or I want to express obliquely an emotion that I'm too cowardly to come out and confront directly, or am I being manipulative? There's lots of reasons that people use language. But what you really should use it for is to state what you believe to be true, and then to let the consequences of that unfold. And so that can also help you. Simple truths, bluntly stated, can be very powerful. You don't need a lot of verbal fluency under those circumstances if there's evidence of strength of character behind it.
It's good for you to go take your place in the world. Have some ambition. Have a vision, have a goal, have a strategy. Try to be a good person, not because it's your duty precisely, because that's the proper way to live. We're in danger of undermining all of that, and it's not good for people. One of the things that I've really learned, for example, recently is that learned to articulate better, is that there's a very tight relationship between aspiration and responsibility. So let's say, well, the first question might be, do you need to aspire to something? And the answer is, well, yes, because you have to do something. If you just sit there, you'll die. You can't just sit there. You have to go act out in the world. Okay, so act towards what? Well, that's whatever your aspiration is. You have to have an aim. Okay, well, what should the aim be? Well, it should be something worth doing, let's say. Why do something that you don't feel is worth doing? What do you think's worth doing? Well, if you watch other people and you judge when they're doing something worthwhile, you usually judge them positively if you see that they're taking responsibility, at least for themselves. What, do you want to be completely useless so other people have to take care of you? That's pretty pathetic. And maybe you could get your act together so you're taking care of yourself and your family. And maybe you could even do better than that and take care of yourself and your family and your community.
There's lots of ways of defying the crowd, let's say. I mean, you could live your life the way that you want to live it. That's a matter of action. You know, and they say actions speak louder than words. And one of the best things you could possibly be is an inspirational example. So that's not nothing. That's something. Live properly in your defiance of the crowd, right? Make your own course. Allow yourself to be guided by your own genuine principles. You don't necessarily have to advertise that, which is in some sense what you're doing when you're debating, because you're taking the manner in which you act, like if you're an integrated person and you're articulating that. But maybe you can't do that because you don't have the verbal skills. Well, then the question would be, maybe you should develop some more verbal skills. I don't know this for sure, Dave, you know, but generally it's useful. How do you do that? Doesn't hurt to read. Really doesn't hurt to write. You know, a little bit of writing every day clarifies your thinking.
You need a value hierarchy. It's inevitable that you have a value hierarchy and that you look at the world through it, and that it should be well structured, and that there should be something of divine importance at the top. I would say what should occupy the top position is the realization, for example, that each person is of divine value, and that the most appropriate way of interacting with potential is by embodying and speaking the truth. That's not a bad way of briefly conceptualizing what might be at the highest pinnacle of the value structure. I would say that's what the logos is. And so the soul is what manifests itself in the choice between different pathways, in the choice between different ways of transforming the potential of the future into the actuality of the present. And it does that by making ethical decisions, by choosing between good and evil at each choice point. And to the degree that it chooses good, then it takes the raw potential of the future and it transforms it into the being of the present that is good. And to the degree that it does that in a manner that's evil and contaminated by malevolence and hatred and vengefulness, then it takes a pathway that corrupts the world and makes things worse. And it's the soul that's doing that, and it's the soul that's responsible for that. And it's also that active part of the soul that's shaping the deeper soul in some sense, which would be something like the cumulative consequence of all those choices, something akin to what people more classically have referred to as character.
Your life doesn't have meaning without aspiration or an aim. Okay, so you need a hierarchy of values. There's got to be something at the top. It's got to be something important. If you don't have that, your life doesn't have any meaning. So if you criticize the hierarchy, or even the idea of hierarchy, you destroy the idea of aspiration, and then people have nothing. Well, that's not helpful. People are built for a struggle, and they're built for a weight, and you want to take on a heavy burden voluntarily. See if you can put yourself together. See what you can do out in the world while you're waiting to die. It's an all-in game. It better be worthwhile. And so there's a tight relationship between responsibility and aspiration and hierarchy. And when you criticize those things, you get rid of the aspiration.
If you want another amazing Jordan Peterson video, check it out right there next to me. I think you'll love it. Continue to believe, and I'll see you there.
I've had clients, many clients in their 30s, who are trying to, this is more true with women, I would say. A lot of women who are very high achieving and who established their career goals at 30 and then want to differentiate